now to bring this research up to date. So as Douglas kindly mentioned, so I'm Kate Dommett. I'm Professor of Digital Politics at the University of Sheffield. And my research looks at the use of digital technology within electoral politics. So very interested in how political parties and political campaigns are using different digital tools, but also kind of in the impact of what that means for our democracy and the kind of questions that we need to think about there. And my colleague, James Weinberg, is a senior lecturer also in the Department of Politics at Sheffield. And he is a political psychologist and has real expertise in trust and has done a lot of work looking at politicians and trust and the mental health of politicians as well. And what we wanted to do today is guide you through some of the kind of key headlines of work that we have done together in one article, also with our collaborator, Nikki Sue, who used to work with us here at Sheffield and now actually works at TikTok in their policy team. So it's gone into the real world. And also some work that James has done independently on himself based on a recent research project that he has just wrapped up. And the intersect of our two work essentially is around the idea of kind of how we communicate. So me as a political communications scholar, and how people kind of receive and understand that communication, what implications that has for trust particularly. And we're going to kind of talk through that today. But at the outset, I also wanted to mention that we've just started a new research project together, which is the first time we're going to be working together for a longer period of time. We're going to have 3 years. And we've got this project called PodTrust, which is the potential for optimizing digital trust, which is a project where we're going to be looking at how can elected representatives use tools like AI chatbots? How might they work with digital influencers in ways that can help enhance trust in different publics? So this is a theme that is running through our previous work, but also in the projects that we are going to take on. So we're really interested in hearing the perspectives of people at Campaign Lab about the kind of practical challenges and particular scenarios that you're considering and working on. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm going to dive straight in and kind of set you up the puzzle and then hand over to James to go through some of our key findings. But what we're hoping by the end of this session is that you will have some clear answers to some questions around why contact matters and what you might be able to do to have better contact between political actors and citizens. So let me see if I can skip my slides. There we go. So our kind of foundation of our research is this idea that there is a crisis of political trust. It's really hot topic at the moment, and I think we've seen a lot of political interest from the Labour government in responding to the crisis of trust. But this is a long-term trend, and I think as this kind of Ipsos Mori graph indicates, politicians fare pretty badly relative to other professions. Now, I'm sure this comes as nothing of a surprise to any of you, but that poses a real challenge, and actually understanding how we respond to that situation isn't entirely clear what the immediate response is and what our responsibilities are in order to tackle this. But we do kind of know that, trust is an essential component of the democratic system. And it is really important that people feel able to trust in their elected representatives. So we're very much interested in how do we respond to this, and are there alternative ways or alternative perspectives that we can bring to helping us think about what we might be able to do. Now, unlike other academics, our particular perspective is a little bit different. So when you hear a lot of politicians particularly talk about trust, there's a real idea that it's about the performance of those politicians can help restore trust. So we've seen this a little bit recently around discussions of the economy. We need society to be performing better, for people to be able to feel that economic benefit in their pockets, to be able to have them feel like they trust that the system delivers for them as individuals. And this kind of perspective is very understandable, and I think there's a lot of mileage in it. But from our perspective, it's problematic because it takes agency, or rather the focus, away from individual politicians and from other people who are active within the space. And what we're interested in is not kind of the trust as in institutions or in groups of people, but actually what you can do as an individual or a single politician or a single political campaigner to help try and restore trust. And that's a really interesting of discussion, we think, because it actually shows that there are things that we might be able to do on a day-to-day level in our everyday practices of campaigning that would help improve trust over time. And so that's the kind of question that we're asking, is what, if you take that perspective, then actually what should those actions be to help improve trust? One of the things that we've been thinking about is the possibility of political contact and those moments where politicians or political actors of different varieties kind of come into contact with the public. Now, political contact is often talked about in quite negative terms recently, and I think that illustration of that is this diagram, which is that we've seen this kind of huge increase in the amount of contact between citizens and their elected representatives. So this data is quite out of date now. It's from the 2010s, but you can see this huge increase in just the number of individual moments at which citizens were reaching out to politicians, from 2,600 letters in the 1920s up to it's over 100,000, I think, now. So, you know, massive increase, and we've heard about a lot of MPs' offices in particular finding that degree of contact, all of those coming in, really overwhelming and quite challenging to address. So that aspect of political contact has been considered and explored, but we see that as potentially an opportunity because actually people are reaching out more, and there is these increased instances of connection between citizens and their elected representatives. But what we're kind of interested in is, well, how can you optimize that point of contact? How can you get the best benefit out of that in terms of trust? And so we posed this question that is around, you know, what does it mean with the kind of the frequency, the style, and the format of political contact? How might that affect people's satisfaction for democracy, but also their broader trust in the system? And we don't have a clear answer to that question, but what we do have is a pre-existing body of work from psychology that has consistently showed that when people come into direct contact with others, whether they be kind of from a different viewpoint or within conflict zones, actually that can have really, really positive results. Direct contact can help improve trust, and importantly, it can also help repair trust where there was distrust in evidence. So these findings for us suggest that if we take this into the political arena, there might be things that we can do in the nature of those interactions between citizens and politicians, which would also exhibit these kind of carryover characteristics. So that leads us to kind of pose three questions. And this is what we're going to talk you through for the remainder of the time that we've got. And this is what we think will hopefully be helpful for you. So we have these three questions. First is there a relationship between political contact and trust in politicians? So that's kind of extending this psychology literature and seeing if it does carry over. Does the quality of political contact, and by this we mean kind of if a politician sends an auto response email, or if they send a kind of highly tailored, you know, thank you so much for your email, I'd like to invite you to come into my office and discuss this further, does that affect people's satisfaction and their likelihood of future engagement? But also, does the speed of that response also play a role? So does it matter if you respond straight away or leave that email 3 or 4 weeks? We're not really clear what's there. So we're going to present some experimental data that helps you appreciate which factors or what approach to take in responding to contact from citizens. And then finally, can positive political contact counteract distrust amongst citizens? And I think back to that opening slide about this trend in distrust growing over time. We see that as really important for thinking about this as the kind of restorative potential. And this links to our next research project about the potential of these different interactions. So with that, I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk us through some of the findings.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate. And nice to meet all of you on this call. It's nice to have an hour off at lunchtime to talk about interesting things. Just in case people can't hear me across the call, it'd be great to mute. That always makes it easier for everyone to listen. So then, let's take this first research question. Is there actually a relationship between political contact and trust? Is it worth getting your local representative, your candidates, yourself, if you are an elected representative, in front of citizens and increasing those moments of contact? In my own research, I thought a good place to start exploring the potential of this was to actually ask politicians themselves. So in a prior study I did with a few hundred politicians across 5 countries, I interviewed a target subsample of 51 of them. And within those interviews, I asked them, what do you think can be done to build trust? Not mentioning political contact per se, just asking them the open question of what can be done to build trust. That led to almost 2,000 minutes of audio, which were transcribed and then multiple coded for different strategies. And the politicians in that sample came up with 8 strategies that were commonplace across all 5 countries and mentioned by at least 10% of the sample in each case. Those were the criteria for entering this list. And as I'd hoped, hypothesized, political contact was in there. Now, the way I've ordered them here is not my own subjective opinion on how important each of these strategies are. And by the way, I'm not going to go through all of them, but feel free to ask me about them at the end. I've done some follow-up work on others apart from political contact here. They're here according to what politicians themselves think. So having derived these 8 different strategies from the interview data, I presented these strategies to a sample of 75 UK politicians who I'm currently working with on a new study of newly elected elites in the UK and elsewhere. And I asked them to order these strategies in order of how important or effective they thought they might be. And as you can see, those personal strategies, political contact, authentic communication, are up there in the top 3 or 4. And the policy performance that we see is kind of dominant in political science and in also government thinking is still up there in first place, but it's alongside these other strategies available to politicians. So politicians themselves then think there is some sort of abrasive potential in pursuing the idea of political contact. What was the general feeling coming out of those interviews then in terms of what participants were saying about political contact? Well, the overarching principle is politicians thought that citizens were far more likely to form accurate impressions of their characteristics, especially those they thought of as their trustworthy characteristics, if they got a chance to interact with them directly, as opposed to being filtered through a third party or being mediated by some sort of influencer or virtual media. This quote here is quite eloquent of that. This politician was saying, I always try to get personal and make it about me and them. I've got an amazing team and I know my staff are very diligent in doing casework and going back to constituents with problems. I attend all my surgeries. I'm always there speaking directly to my constituents. And I think that makes a difference. Okay, so this is what politicians think. Does it play out in practice? Now, at the time that I was interviewing these politicians, I'd already fielded a survey back in the first week of our first COVID lockdown to a representative sample of 1,200 members of the UK public. And at that point, I was just looking at their attitudes to COVID governance measures, but I'd included measures of trust. And I decided what I would do is follow up almost 18 months later in December 2021 with those same participants, measure levels of trust again, but also ask them to report any forms or modes of contact they had with elected politicians in the interim. Now, the pandemic was actually an interesting moment to think about political contact and trust, because we already knew that trust was highly labile. It was moving around and mostly in a negative direction. Rates of contact and communication between politicians and public were increasing, as this quote from one of my interviewees intimates. And we also know that policy satisfaction was down amongst all groups of voters. So if political contact was going to have an impact on trust over and above the performance perspective, it was likely to come out during the COVID pandemic. So we've got these various measures then at time point 1 and 2. And if the hypothesis about contact is right, then we'd expect that citizens who experienced contact during the pandemic are going to have more positive evaluations of politicians' trustworthiness. The second hypothesis here is based on the social psych literature that direct personal interactions would lead to stronger effects. So what did I find? Well, as per other surveys, trust was down 13% in the sample between wave 1 and 2. Distrust was up. Mistrust, that kind of skeptical checking and monitoring of politicians, was pretty stable. In terms of contact, we had about 20% of the sample who'd interacted with the politician directly, either in person or virtually over email. Most of the sample, 4/5, had watched politicians being interviewed or making speeches on television, a kind of impersonal virtual contact, and just over half had received some form of literature from candidates and incumbents through the post during that period. Just under 10% had had no political contact whatsoever, and fewer than 50% of the sample selected more than one of these options, suggesting that political contact remains the exception rather than the norm, especially where it is personal and direct. So what was the effect? Well, I created a weighted scale for political contact, each of those options you've just seen listed, and ran some simple regression analysis of the change in individual levels of trust over that pandemic period, with my contact scale as an independent variable, a host of demographic controls that we know influence trust, as well as individual policy satisfaction, thus controlling for that performance perspective. And what I find is that contact does seem to make a difference. The more contact individuals had had during that period, and in particular, the more direct contacts they had had through email or in person, the less likely they were to have lost any trust at all during that period. And in fact, in that subsample, that 20% who had interacted directly with the politician, there was no significant change in trust between early 2020 and end of 2021, which made them a significant outlier compared to the trends in the other 4/5 of the population. Okay, so if contact does matter, then we're also interested in whether the quality of that contact matters and how. So Kate and I and Nikki ran a fairly simple survey experiment to look at the effect of both quality and time. The hypotheses here being that actually the more bespoke and tailored politicians' responses to the public are, the more likely that individual will be satisfied with that moment of contact, and the more likely they will be to re-engage. The same in the case of time. If you reply quickly, citizens will be more satisfied and more likely to re-engage. How do we go about doing this? It was a kind of survey vignette experiment. We had 4 different contact media, so face-to-face, letter, email, social media. We had 3 different types of response quality, whether the response that a member of the public got from their politician was automated, whether it was personalized, so it spoke, it used names and personal details from the initial point of contact in the response, and whether it was engaged. So not only was it personalized, but it offered a next step, a follow-up, something of that ilk. And then there was response time, either 1 to 2 days, 2 weeks, or 1 month. And all of our participants went through 4 of these iterations with 4 different policy topics. So plastic pollution, train fares, NHS waiting times, homelessness, which we screened with a pilot sample to make sure that the distributions of importance across those topics were equal. And in all cases, we've randomized both the linkage between media and policy topic, the order of hypothetical scenarios by contact, by topic and media, and obviously the other 2 treatments for quality and time themselves. And we asked our participants after each of those iterations how satisfied they were and how likely they would have been to contact that MP. Again, some examples of the treatments here, but I can always talk about those later rather than getting you to read those. And obviously you've got a link to the paper in the invite for today's event. Did we see treatment validity, both in the pilot and then in the main sample? We asked our participants to provide an open text response at the very end of the experiment to reflect on the reasons that had, or the factors that had influenced their decision in each of those experimental scenarios. And we used these keywords that came out, or these highly frequent terms, to do a kind of keyword in context search. And what we find is that the quality of the response and the speed of the response were the primary reasons that participants were giving, or the primary factors they were considering when deciding how satisfied they were and how likely they were to re-engage. What did we find? Well, without going into the intricacies of all our coefficients and different modeling, two key things stood out. Finding one, style does matter. So personalized and engaged responses from politicians resulted in much higher self-reported satisfaction amongst our participants, and moderately higher likelihoods of recontacting the MP compared to automated responses. And that held across all policy topics and all forms of media. I'm really enjoying these green ticks as well. I'm hoping
It's great.
I'm hoping that's a sign of positive praise. As a teacher, I love green ticks and positive praise, so please carry on. And then finding two was about was an interesting one. So we found that actually style mattered far more than speed. How quickly the politician responded didn't seem to turn the dial that much on satisfaction and re-engagement. So an automated response, or any response at all, received 1 to 2 days, only caused a marginal improvement of kind of less than 1 point in participant satisfaction, whereas a personalized or engaged response could 4 to 5 point increase in satisfaction across our scale, regardless of the time it took for the MP to respond. So that would imply actually in a world where politicians are beset by increased volumes of contact, it's far better to wait and take your time to offer considered, personalized or engaged responses than it is to rush to send out an automated reply, especially if you don't have the capacity to follow up on that at a later point in time. And some of our participants reflected this in their open text comments. So, this participant here, I knew I could contact the MP again when they had replied so personally, and as they were also concerned about the issue I was raised. If the MP had sent an automated reply to me, that meant they didn't really care. Okay, so our third research question was about this link then between the quality of content and political distrust. Now, outside of the experiment, we got our participants to complete a proxy index of distrust taken from the British election study based on a battery of anti-politics sentiment. We then interacted these scores with our treatments to look at the effect of our treatments across those anti-politics scores in the experiment. And what we found very simply, and also maybe slightly surprisingly, is that the style of politicians' responses when contacted actually had a bigger impact on the most distrustful participants in our sample. Why was this? Well, we didn't have a chance to do a follow-up, but I would, or we infer from these findings that actually someone who comes into a moment of contact already skeptical and distrustful of politicians and what they might do for them actually has the greatest potential to have their attitudes moved by positive responses that show genuine care and engagement. All right, I think I've probably spoken long enough, and we've still got 5 minutes left for the presentation. So what I'll do is I'll pass back to Kate, give you a few concluding comments about implications and next steps.
So brilliant. So these are the things we think that you can take home that you might want to use to inform your own practice on the ground. So firstly, I think that our research has been able to show that contact between politicians and citizens can create more resilient, trust-based relationships. So it really kind of can help to counter that decline in trust that we started out with and diagnosed as a problem. We've also shown that you can actually improve people's satisfaction by tailoring your responses to being more personalised. And importantly, that it's fine to take longer to do that. So rather than feeling pushed to respond really fast and to follow up instantly on an interaction that you've had with a citizen, actually taking that time, as long as you are engaging more with the kind of detail or reflecting about the specifics of that engagement, then you can result in these positive improvements, which I think is a really important insight for campaigns. So we kind of say that really creates an incentive for campaigns on the ground to invest in this kind of engaged and interactive communication with citizens. And once again, just to re-underline, speed is definitely less important than showing that genuine care and attention. So hopefully that kind of helps give you some things to think about in terms of, how quickly should you follow up after a door knocking session, or should you feel that you have to instantly respond to an email from a citizen? Actually, those things are less important. But it also raises these questions around, how we deliver this kind of interactive communication and around what that personalized content mean and the capacity of politicians to be able to deliver that. And we're really interested in that question in terms of, we recognize that politicians only have so much time of the day. You do have an increased volume of points of contact just when we come to kind of correspondence. So there's this really interesting question that we're now starting to think about in our new project about, are there actually digital tools that could help either in the back office, so kind of using AI to kind of aggregate themes that are coming through in emails and to develop tailored or personalized responses. Could those things be a helpful back office tool that you might be able to develop? And what consequences might it have if citizens know that you're using those tools? Like, could there be downside or risks associated? And we're also thinking about, are there different types of media that can have an interacting effect here? So, is working with influencers something that could add a positive effect, or is email or face-to-face a better form of contact? So there are a whole range of new questions, which is always the delight of being an academic, is that you answer one set of questions and a whole another one opens. But I think at this point, it's a really good moment for us to stop, hear your questions about what has resonated or where would you like further detail or reflection. But we're also particularly really keen, as I said at the beginning, to hear, what are those challenges or those difficult questions that you're grappling with as campaigners that it would be helpful for us to hear about, so that we can ensure that the research that we're doing is going to be valuable for the kind of everyday interactions that you're having on the ground. So I'll leave it there and hand back over to Douglas.
Thank you, Kate. We've got a number of questions. Just as a quick reminder, we are recording these episodes. They will be available on the Campaign Lab YouTube channel after this, and we will put together a blog post about this. But questions, please raise your hand if you've got any questions for Kate and James. Thank you so much, Kate and James. I see that some have come up in the chat as well, but if you yes, Saul. I'll actually, Kate and James, I'll let you handle the questions. But to get us started, Saul and Rachel, please go first, Saul.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, guys. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. I just wanted to ask about the time limits. Somebody was saying that time limits are less important than the quality of the response. But is there a point at which, is there a sort of deadline by which the response then becomes less effective? I mean, is 2 months too long? There must be a point at which people aren't receptive anymore after they've sent the original email.
Really good question, Sol. So I guess in this single experiment we did, we were trying to pick 3 representative time points for the responses. I would imagine there is a plateauing effect where personalized responses stop being as effective because the time has taken so long. But that might also be contingent on the nature of the problem that has led to that citizen initiating contact in the first place, whether it's an enduring problem, an emergent problem, one that is time sensitive or not. These are all questions we're going to be asking in this project we've got at the moment, where we're going to be doing some field experiments with politicians and looking at their interactions over time with a variety of citizens from different groups. So we can always come back to you if we find an interesting result on that front. But I would intuitively suggest that the effects would plateau after a certain amount of time.
Thank you.
Rachel, do you want to go next?
Yeah, there we go. So I think it would be really interesting to have a look at this in terms of career politicians or paid politicians and voluntary politicians, as it were, because I'm mostly interested in local government, local politics, and it seems to me if you're an MP, that is your job, and you've got a team helping you. Whereas at local level, you might be trying to balance being a politician alongside working full time, and obviously that must affect how much time you've got to do this. So I put in the chat concerns about the way local government is going, because it seems to be that the territories are getting bigger and bigger, and so you've got more and more people to interact with. And that seems to me likely to be disadvantaging anybody that's trying to combine being a politician and doing anything else like working or bring up a family or caring for people or whatever. So I think there's probably a load of stuff in there coming out of the fact that clearly personal interaction is really, really important.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think you've touched on a really important issue, and one that I'm trying to dig a little deeper into in another new project I've just started with newly elected politicians. So in that study, I've got 5 countries, and in 2 of them, the UK and Australia, I'm also surveying and interviewing local councillors and state MPs to try and, certainly in one module of that particular project, look at the difference and similarity in the challenges they raise. So are those challenges around prioritization, time management, engagement, distrust similar regardless of the tier of politics that you engage in? Or are there some large or subtle differences between the two? So I think it's a really good question. It's not one I have an answer to give you at the moment, but it's one that I'm seeking an answer to.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem at all. Or any other? I'm just having a scroll through the chat to have a look. Yeah, I would say casework does really matter. I'm just going around to your comments, Hannah. I think what it also shows is there's some kind of nice research that's been done around like campaigning contacts as well, which shows like multiple points of contact also help in the kind of effort to mobilize, and less so, but still to some degree to persuade people. And I think kind of, you know, there are different types of engagement that you might have as a campaigner, but I think from the campaigning side, we know that interacting with people via different media can really help in that effort to try and mobilize and persuade people. So like there used to be a kind of old adage, it's a little out of date now, but you know, you should contact by kind of 3 different channels. So you should leaflet, you should door knock, and then you should telephone. And that's from kind of old school advertising literature. So I think that kind of idea of like contact is actually relevant for a whole range of purposes, also beyond trust as well. So it might not be that your goal is to kind of uphold the democratic system, as we each as individuals strive to do. But I think this is a kind of a nice virtuous advantage as well. So, you know, whether you're thinking about kind of relational campaigning and the power of that to be able to advance specific electoral goals, there are also broader democratic goals. And I think that actually provides a nice framework and an additional way of explaining why you're doing this. It's not just like casework, door knocking, campaign activity on the ground is not just purely instrumental. Our research shows that it actually has broad positive implications for the kind of democracy that we would want to uphold. And I think that can be maybe a useful way of trying to explain to people, you know, why are you knocking on my door at 9 o'clock in the Sunday morning? It's like, we're doing it for democracy and trust. So, Kath, I think you put your hand up first. Do you want to come in?
Thank you. I did put one of my questions in the chat actually, which is kind of how personalized is personalized? Does just kind of using someone's name cut it, or do you have to kind of really explicitly engage much more than that. And also I'm interested, so I work across a group of MPs, and sometimes when there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of emails on a particular issue, we will do a standardized response, but we'll kind of acknowledge that, and we'll say, we've had thousands of people write to us, it's really valuable, thank you so much. Apologies for not doing a personal response, but the best way to write back to you is just to do this collectively. I've read all your comments, thank you so much for them, and even if I don't respond to them directly. Did you look at all about whether that kind of thing has an impact on trust and how people feel in terms of satisfaction? Thanks.
That is a great question. So I'm just pulling up what we did in the experiment as to how we framed this. Any academic will tell you that these experiments are very frustrating because you have to limit what you experimentally manipulate. But for the personalised response, we said that the MP addresses the individual by name, engages with everything you said in the letter, and promises. Hang on, let me read this. Am I saying this right? Yeah, so they address you by name. They say that they engage with what you're talking about, and they promise that they're going to kind of work hard to address that particular issue, is how we framed it. So it was quite a specific operationalization of what we meant by personalization that had those three components. We would need to kind of go away and do further tests to look at like which particular aspects of that had the most explanatory power. But I think that we've tried to frame it broadly enough that it would capture that kind of nature of interaction that you would get almost in a kind of letter or email scenario, rather than being really kind of fine-grained, because we recognise that was beyond the capacity of what most politicians could realistically do. I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I think it's useful to explain how that compared to the other treatments. So in the kind of automated responses that citizens received were very much like the ones you're just talking about there. That automated reply that goes back almost instantly to say, your email or letter or whatever it might be, phone call has been received. We acknowledge it. We're working hard to get back to you, and your opinions really matter to us. So that was the automated response, compared to the personalized one, where the response was addressing the constituent by name, engaging with the specific points in their contact, sometimes quoting those back at them, and then making some sort of promise of a follow-up action. The engaged final treatment was exactly the same, but at the end, there was an invitation for a further point of contact. So even though the automated response expressed gratitude and implied that the citizen was really valued, it still wasn't moving the dial anywhere near as much by comparison to those other two sets of treatments.
It might also be worth just clarifying, going back to the earlier question about time, that we said that each of those types of responses could either happen 1 or 2 days later, 2 weeks later, or over a month later. So if we're kind of thinking about the length of that, we were kind of framing it in terms of over a month. So that's the kind of time frame we're talking about. We didn't put an end cap on that. So I think that's why we want to do that follow-up work to see when that positive effect does tail off. Thank you so much for that question. I think that was really interesting. Do we have any others?
Did Ian Chandler have his hand up?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. It's I think it's suspected outside the scope of your study, but it is in relation to that contact, and it's about the follow-up. I mean, as a local politician with no staff to do the casework, I mean, often you get a casework. Sometimes it is a matter of you acknowledge it and said, yeah, I will contact the council or whatever it is and try and get them to take action. But sometimes, often it needs you're asking more questions of the council, and you've got to go back to them. It's the follow-up side of things in terms of after that initial acknowledgement, at what point going back to the constituent to say, actually, yes, I have taken action. I have contacted whoever it is, the authorities, and this is the response I've got. How that then is also part of that quality. And I think, again, not in your study, but maybe in your work in terms of digital support for politicians, is to what extent is that we all struggle with having casework software where we can actually automate some of that follow-up work and remind us. And we're so envious of MPs with their staff teams and what have you. But those types of things, that quality of that follow-up, and if you don't have that follow-up, quite often I forget. And then I get a nagging email from someone saying, "Oh, you promised to follow this up." And I'm like, right, okay, yes, so I did. I still haven't had a response from the council on this one. So it's that type of thing that I think maybe also challenges some of that credibility.
Great point. I mean, so there's two things I would say there. One is this is a question for the next project in terms of looking at the balance between the effect of that moment of contact in and of itself, i.e. content and what happens in that moment, versus the importance of the outcome for these attitudes and behaviors that citizens display afterwards. And we anticipate that the balance of importance between those two variables will vary based on the reasons why the initial point of contact has been initiated, the demographic group from which contact has been initiated, and the mapping against the demographic of the MP, and also the time taken for an outcome to be delivered. The second part of my answer is actually about how politicians communicate inside and outside of that moment of communication. So on one of the slides I showed, I said that my interviewees in that early study had raised the idea of what I call authentic communication as a strategy for building trust. What this boiled down to was making contingent promises rather than standard promises, i.e. not saying I will do X, but if Y and Z line up, I'll do X for you, and matching that with honest explanations of failure when they're not able to deliver. And I did test that in another set of experiments. And what I found was that at the moment a promise is made to deliver on something for a citizen, standard promises and contingent promises have pretty much the same effect. They're not changing how much the individual trusts that MP there and then, or local politician. But when that politician couldn't deliver at time point 2 on what they'd promised, and the contingent promise was matched with an honest explanation of the external reasons why they hadn't been able to deliver, i.e. the council's not got back to me, actually the participants maintained most of the trust they'd had at time point 1 compared to those who'd received standard promises and some sort of obfuscation or blame avoidance behavior at time point 2, and were still much more likely than the others to still vote for that politician, even though they hadn't delivered on that promise. So there's something here not only about the outcomes per se that you can deliver, but the way in which you frame and communicate your ability to deliver inside and outside of those moments of contact with your electors.
Yeah, I can only underline that, but with a very different set of research. So when I started out as an academic, I wrote a book called The Reimagined Party, where I went round and did a whole series of kind of what we call deliberative focus groups. These are like 4-hour focus groups where we asked people what they wanted from political parties and then talked them through different scenarios, gave them different bits of information, asked them to react and kind of come up with a vision of what they wanted. And then also paired that with a public opinion survey. And one of the big things that kept coming up was that expectations really, really matter, and that politicians and parties in that instance can do an awful lot in terms of shaping accurate expectations at that point, and that over-promising or being seen to kind of not be clear about the outcomes can have a really negative effect. So when we found that people would kind of come in with their usual party and campaign bashing attitude, and the more we kind of talked to them about the complexities of what it was actually for a political party to operate and govern and how that would therefore affect their views, they really shifted their position. And so I think that kind of really shows that there's a real opportunity for you in those points of contact to, as James was saying, kind of really shape what people are going to expect, because they're much more likely to be happy with the outcome if they go in with realistic expectations, which I think is why this kind of over-promising is quite so dangerous around like trust and people's views of politicians.
I think that's really interesting. Sorry if I can just come back in and carry on that, because I think I'm a Green Party politician, and the polls or the surveys would show that Green Party is trusted more than the other parties, and yet we're also criticised for having the most unrealistic promises in terms of what we can deliver on climate. So there's a slight dissonance there, but I think it's more to do with the fact that we stick to our principles and we're not swayed. But I think, can I just follow up on the other thing that said about the demographics, because I thought it was really interesting. Is there any difference between people who vote and people who don't vote? And also difference in terms of different demographics and education levels, which is obviously linked to levels of voting turnout as well.
Yeah, so let's take the latter first of all, because it's much easier to measure. So in the work I've done, both in what presented here and elsewhere, I find that actually when it comes to contact, those with higher education levels and greater knowledge about politics per se tend to be much more satisfied with both the content and outcome of contacting and interacting with a politician. Now, in terms of those who vote and don't vote, that's really hard, because those who don't vote don't tend to ever initiate contact with their politician and avoid being contacted wherever possible. So one of the things we're actually interested in this new project is how top-down contact, i.e. initiated by politicians to reach a wider audience, can still have some of these positive outcomes we're seeing in bottom-up initiated contact. And that includes those hard-to-reach groups who aren't already engaged in politics. So again, it's a bit of a watch this space answer. What I was going to add, and this is kind of an ask back to the audience, really. So I said that in this new project, we're going to be doing field experiments. There is only so much you can gather via surveys, lab experiments, getting people into artificial scenarios. Findings are much more robust and generalizable when you gather them in the field. And we're planning to do that in 18 months, 2 years' time with MPs in a couple of countries. But I think what this call has shown and what some of the comments and questions have shown is that there's real appetite and possibly a different set of questions to ask vis-a-vis exploring that at the local level. And we have a number of councillors on this call. So if you find this work interesting and if you would like to be involved in those field experiments and work with us, please let us know, and we will be in touch with you again when we get to that phase of our project.
Well, I don't think there's any more questions, but I'll just say in response to Lynn's comment about a lot of our findings being very similar to the field of conflict resolution. I feel like a lot of politicians probably feel like they're battling in the field of conflict resolution. So it's very good to draw that analogy. But I definitely agree. Super.
Thank you so much, Kate and James. Hang on, I'm a slight co. There we go. Thank you so much for joining us. That was really fascinating, and I think everybody learned a lot. I'm just going to, before you go, because it's really important to record the impact of these things, is launch a little quiz. And if everybody can fill this in, it's a little poll, which is like, has this changed how you'll think about campaigning going forward? And would you like more of these presentations? So hopefully you can all see that on your screen. And if people could all participate, this helps us like make the case for doing more of these sessions. And yeah, you can see 7 people have participated. We need we need to reach 17. I'm going to keep asking you until you do. This is the organizer in me. We're on 14 out of 16. Somebody left the call. That's a fair outcome. Brill. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. 17 out of 17. 100% participation. And I'll share the results for you guys. So hopefully you can see that. But thank you again, James and Kate. Fascinating stuff. I think really key, like lots of your research is key to some of the heart of some of the questions that us on the ground as campaigners are trying to figure out. So yeah, really, really grateful for that. And yeah, what we'll do is we'll record the session, we'll put it on our website, we'll write a little blog, and we'll also make sure to share around. I think there was some requests for James's research and Kate's research. So James and Kate, we might come back to you and ask you for links to your research and make sure that's all sent around to everybody, and your contact details so people can reach out if they're interested in those experiments. And also we'll make sure to, like, our networks of people we're running field experiments with this year, make sure that we kind of refer them on when your project starts, which sounds it's a slightly later timeline. But hopefully we'll discover something for that, which would be good. But yeah, thank you everybody, and thanks for coming along.
Thanks. We'd love to see the results of
Good.
that poll as well, Hannah. I pressed close a little too soon.
Brill, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.